Melinda Loveless was born into a world that offered little stability or security. From the earliest years of her life, the environment around her was marked by tension, unpredictability, and neglect. Her family circumstances were far from ideal, her parents struggled with their own personal demons, and the household was often chaotic. Reports from relatives and acquaintances painted a picture of a home where conflict was common, affection was rare, and supervision was minimal. Even as a young child, Melinda would have been acutely aware of the instability surrounding her, an awareness that would quietly shape her perceptions of relationships, trust, and authority. Her mother, though physically present, was inconsistent in her parenting, oscillating between moments of care and periods of emotional withdrawal. Melinda's father, when present, was reportedly volatile, prone to outbursts that filled the home with fear and tension. Witnesses from her early life recalled instances where Melinda was left to fend for herself or was punished harshly for minor transgressions. These early experiences created a sense of insecurity and a distorted understanding of boundaries, reinforcing the idea that the world was unpredictable and potentially hostile. School provided little refuge. Teachers noted Melinda's difficulty in social interactions, often describing her as withdrawn or unusually aggressive for her age. Her peers reported that she could be both charming and confrontational, switching between these behaviors with little warning. Early behavioral problems were evident, including defiance, minor theft, and frequent conflicts with classmates. While some of these actions were dismissed as typical adolescent behavior, the pattern of repeated aggression and disregard for rules suggested deeper underlying issues. School counselors and social workers occasionally intervened, but the support structures in place were insufficient to address the complex dynamics at home. Melinda's exposure to violence began at a young age, both in her family and the surrounding community. Domestic disputes and arguments were common, and she witnessed conflicts that many children would find traumatic. These experiences normalized aggression in her mind, teaching her that power and control could be asserted through intimidation and anger. Additionally, she was exposed to environments where criminal behavior, substance abuse, and neglect intersected. These influences reinforced a worldview where moral boundaries were fluid, and personal survival often depended on manipulation and assertiveness rather than empathy or cooperation. Relatives and neighbors also observed Melinda's early fascination with control and dominance. Even in play, she demonstrated a tendency to assert authority over other children, using threats or aggression to achieve her aims. While curiosity and assertiveness are common in children, her behaviors were marked by a level of intensity and persistence that alarmed some adults. She exhibited little regard for the feelings of others, and her responses to discipline were often defiant or evasive. These early signs would later resurface in more dangerous ways, indicating that her behavioral tendencies were rooted not solely in adolescence but in patterns established during childhood. Another contributing factor to Melinda's early development was a lack of stable role models. Positive examples of healthy relationships and constructive problem-solving were scarce. Adults who might have provided guidance were either preoccupied with their own struggles or absent from her life entirely. Without consistent mentorship or boundaries, Melinda was left to navigate complex social and emotional terrain on her own. This absence contributed to the formation of maladaptive coping mechanisms, including manipulation, aggression, and a growing sense of detachment from the consequences of her actions. Health and psychological evaluations conducted later in her life suggest that Melinda may have been affected by trauma-related developmental issues. Exposure to stress and violence during formative years can disrupt emotional regulation, empathy development, and impulse control. While no single event defined her trajectory, the cumulative effect of chronic neglect, exposure to aggression, and inconsistent caregiving created an environment in which dangerous behaviors could take root. Experts note that children who grow up in such conditions often struggle to form secure attachments, experience difficulty with authority figures, and develop a skewed moral compass, all factors that would later become evident in Melinda's actions. Despite the challenges of her early life, Melinda displayed a certain intelligence and resourcefulness. She was able to read social cues, adapt to changing circumstances, and manipulate situations to her advantage. While these skills might have been assets in a supportive environment, in the context of neglect and exposure to violence, they became tools for deception and control. Her ability to navigate complex social interactions while masking emotional instability foreshadowed the duality of her character, a mix of charm and menace, vulnerability and cruelty. By the end of her childhood, Melinda Loveless had already developed patterns of behavior that would shape her later life. The combination of neglect, exposure to violence, inconsistent parenting, and lack of positive role models created fertile ground for aggression, manipulation, and antisocial tendencies. While outwardly she could appear normal, even engaging in moments of affection or play, the underlying psychological currents were building toward a trajectory that would eventually lead to criminal activity. Understanding this early period is crucial, as it provides context for the complexity of her character and the foundation for the choices she would later make. The story of Melinda's early years is not one of inevitability but of warning. It demonstrates how environmental factors, when left unaddressed, can contribute to the development of destructive behaviors. Her childhood illustrates the interplay between personal temperament and external circumstances, highlighting the ways in which trauma and neglect can mold a mind capable of shocking acts. The seeds of her later actions were planted here, in the quiet chaos of a home that offered little protection, guidance, or stability, a troubled beginning that would echo throughout her life. By the time Melinda Loveless entered her teenage years, the environment that had shaped her childhood began to manifest more visibly in her behavior. The chaos and neglect of her early years were no longer just background noise, they had formed patterns of anger, mistrust, and defiance that would define her adolescence. Teachers and family members noticed that she struggled to conform to rules, often challenging authority in ways that were both calculated and unpredictable. Her interactions with peers oscillated between charm and hostility, a reflection of the duality that had begun to dominate her personality. Home continued to be a battlefield. Conflicts with her parents intensified, with minor disagreements escalating into heated arguments that left emotional scars. Her father's volatility and her mother's inconsistency created a push-pull dynamic, leaving Melinda both resentful and dependent. Siblings and relatives reported instances where she exhibited violent outbursts, throwing objects, shouting, or threatening those who crossed her. While some incidents were dismissed as typical teenage rebellion, the persistence and intensity of her reactions suggested deeper psychological unrest. School life mirrored the tension at home. Melinda struggled academically, not necessarily due to lack of intelligence, but because her attention and energy were consumed by interpersonal conflicts and internal anger. Teachers described her as bright but disruptive, often challenging instructions, questioning authority, and engaging in physical or verbal confrontations with classmates. Peer relationships were turbulent, some feared her, while others were drawn to her unpredictability and audacity. Her reputation as someone who could not be easily controlled grew, isolating her from potential sources of support or guidance. During these formative years, Melinda's first encounters with aggressive criminal behavior began to emerge. Reports indicate instances of petty theft, vandalism, and manipulation of younger children, which were often dismissed as mischief but carried undertones of calculated defiance. Her ability to plan and execute minor transgressions without immediate detection revealed an early aptitude for strategic thinking, albeit in destructive forms. Each success reinforced her sense of control and emboldened her to push boundaries further. Peer influence played a significant role in shaping Melinda's trajectory. She gravitated toward groups where rebellion and defiance were normalized, absorbing behaviors that validated her anger and resentment. Within these circles, she could exercise dominance and influence, solidifying patterns of manipulation and intimidation. At the same time, exclusion from other social groups intensified feelings of alienation, contributing to a worldview where power was gained through fear rather than trust or cooperation. The combination of internal rage and external validation created a self-reinforcing cycle that encouraged risk-taking and antisocial behavior. Family trauma continued to leave its mark. Melinda's relationship with her parents remained strained, with moments of confrontation escalating into threats and violence. These interactions reinforced the lesson that aggression could be an effective tool for asserting control. Simultaneously, the absence of consistent positive role models left her without guidance on how to channel anger constructively. Without intervention or mentorship, Melinda's coping mechanisms relied increasingly on intimidation, manipulation, and defiance, behaviors that would later become central to her criminal activities. Psychologists examining adolescent behavior note that individuals exposed to chronic neglect and instability often develop hypervigilance and heightened aggression as protective measures. In Melinda's case, these traits manifested in ways that allowed her to anticipate and react to social dynamics with precision, though always through the lens of hostility and self-preservation. Her ability to read intentions and exploit weaknesses became more sophisticated, signaling the development of a strategic mind with dangerous potential. During adolescence, Melinda also began testing societal boundaries with escalating intensity. Minor pranks and rule-breaking were replaced by more deliberate acts intended to assert dominance or provoke fear. Witness accounts describe her taking pleasure in seeing others intimidated or unsettled by her actions. This early experimentation with power dynamics, combined with emotional detachment, laid the groundwork for future crimes that would shock communities. Every act of rebellion, every calculated confrontation, served as both a rehearsal and a reinforcement for the more severe behaviors to come. Despite the increasing intensity of her aggression, Melinda's exterior often masked the turmoil within. She could present herself as cooperative or charming when it served her purpose, creating a dual persona that allowed her to navigate environments while avoiding immediate consequences. This ability to conceal true intentions became a defining characteristic of her adolescence, foreshadowing the manipulation and deception that would later feature prominently in her criminal life. Her social intelligence, when combined with underlying anger and resentment, made her both unpredictable and dangerous. By the end of her teenage years, patterns that had started in childhood had solidified into consistent behaviors that defined Melinda's interactions with the world. Her aggression, defiance, and manipulative tendencies were no longer isolated incidents but a coherent strategy for survival and control in a world she perceived as hostile. The environment that had nurtured her anger, combined with her emerging psychological sophistication, created a foundation for criminality that would soon escalate into acts of profound violence. The adolescence of Melinda Loveless illustrates the transformation of childhood trauma into calculated aggression. Her story underscores how early neglect, exposure to violence, and the absence of positive guidance can cultivate behaviors that escalate during teenage years. Understanding this period is essential to tracing the trajectory from her early life to the shocking crimes she would commit, revealing the interplay between environment, temperament, and choice that defines her complex and terrifying profile. As Melinda Loveless moved deeper into adolescence, her defiance and aggression began to manifest not just as emotional outbursts, but as deliberate criminal behavior. What had once been minor acts of rebellion gradually escalated into a pattern of deliberate transgression. Witnesses from her neighborhood recalled incidents that, at the time, seemed small: a stolen candy bar, a neighborhood dog left in distress, or petty vandalism, but each event revealed an emerging pattern of disregard for rules, boundaries, and the well-being of others. These early offenses, while often dismissed as typical teenage mischief, were significant warning signs of behaviors that would later evolve into far more dangerous acts. Melinda's first brushes with the law occurred around the age of 13, when reports surfaced of shoplifting and minor theft. These incidents were sporadic but telling. She was not acting out of need but seemingly out of a desire to test limits, to assert control, and to provoke reactions from authority figures. Police reports from the time describe her as cooperative when confronted, yet witnesses noted a striking lack of remorse. This duality, compliance on the surface paired with underlying defiance, became a defining feature of her early criminality. It was a skill she would later exploit in more sophisticated and destructive ways. Beyond theft, Melinda began experimenting with aggressive behaviors toward peers and even younger children. Accounts from schools and community members indicate instances of intimidation, physical confrontations, and manipulative pranks that caused genuine fear. She seemed to derive satisfaction not merely from breaking rules, but from the psychological impact her actions had on others. These behaviors, combined with her established pattern of familial conflict, indicated an emerging comfort with using aggression as a tool for power and control. Early interventions were limited and largely ineffective. Social workers, school counselors, and law enforcement personnel recognized her troubling behaviors, but the systemic response was fragmented. Counseling sessions were sporadic, and any disciplinary measures taken at school or at home failed to address the underlying trauma and aggression. In many cases, Melinda appeared to learn quickly how to manipulate situations, presenting a cooperative exterior while continuing her transgressions in private. Each missed opportunity for meaningful intervention reinforced the trajectory that would carry her from minor offenses into serious criminality. Community reports also highlighted her growing association with peers who engaged in delinquent behavior. These relationships reinforced her tendency toward rebellion and escalation. Together, she and certain peers engaged in increasingly risky acts, vandalism, trespassing, and small-scale theft, often testing the limits of what they could get away with. This period of experimentation was critical in shaping her understanding of consequence, or rather, the lack of it. Melinda's ability to evade accountability while continuing to escalate her behavior strengthened her sense of invincibility, and emboldened her toward more severe acts. By mid-adolescence, the escalation was undeniable. Reports indicate that she began to display behaviors that were overtly aggressive, sometimes bordering on violence. Confrontations with neighbors, altercations at school, and instances of deliberate property damage revealed a growing comfort with intimidation and harm. Her behavior demonstrated not randomness but an emerging strategy, one in which manipulation, aggression, and planning intersected. She was not acting impulsively alone, her actions were increasingly purposeful, aimed at asserting dominance or instilling fear. At this stage, psychological observers began to recognize patterns consistent with conduct disorder and early antisocial tendencies. Melinda's behaviors were not isolated incidents but part of a continuum that linked childhood trauma to criminal escalation. Her early exposure to familial conflict and neglect had fostered an understanding of power dynamics that she now applied externally. Acts that might have once been attempts to gain attention or cope with stress transformed into mechanisms for control and influence over her surroundings. This period of escalation was a crucial turning point, bridging adolescence and the more serious offenses that would define her later years. One of the earliest documented incidents of serious concern involved a confrontation with law enforcement following a pattern of escalating theft and intimidation. Officers who interacted with her noted her calculated demeanor and apparent lack of empathy. Witnesses from the community described a chilling confidence in her actions, as though she understood the fear she could elicit and was deliberately wielding it. These interactions provided clear evidence that Melinda's behavior had evolved beyond mere mischief, signaling an increased risk for harm to others. Despite warnings and interventions, her criminality continued to escalate. Each act, each confrontation, reinforced her emerging belief in her ability to manipulate, intimidate, and evade accountability. From petty theft to more deliberate, aggressive acts, Melinda's adolescence became a testing ground for the darker impulses she had carried since childhood. The repeated lack of effective intervention allowed these behaviors to harden, creating a dangerous feedback loop that would ultimately culminate in crimes with severe consequences for victims and their families. By the end of this period, the trajectory of Melinda Loveless was unmistakable. The combination of early trauma, family dysfunction, peer influence, and ineffective intervention had produced a young individual whose aggression and manipulation were not only normalized in her mind but actively reinforced by her experiences. The escalation from minor acts of defiance to more serious transgressions established the foundation for the crimes that would later bring her notoriety. Understanding this stage of her life is essential, as it provides a clear link between early behaviors and the emergence of calculated, deliberate criminal activity. The story of Melinda's first crimes and their escalation is a stark reminder of how childhood trauma, when left unaddressed, can evolve into destructive behavior. It illustrates the importance of timely intervention and the consequences of systemic failures in identifying and managing high-risk youth. The patterns established during this phase were not fleeting, they were the precursors to actions that would shock her community and eventually the nation, demonstrating how early choices and unchecked impulses can escalate into a life defined by criminality. The incident that thrust Melinda Loveless into public infamy began on a seemingly ordinary day, yet it would unravel a series of events that stunned the local community and highlighted the extreme escalation of her criminal behavior. Lori Dan, a young girl from the same town, became the central figure in a crime that was both calculated and horrifying. While Melinda's earlier transgressions had hinted at a capacity for manipulation and aggression, this event marked a clear transition from juvenile delinquency to serious, violent crime. According to law enforcement records, the abduction was meticulously planned. Melinda, with the involvement of accomplices, identified Lori as a vulnerable target, choosing a moment when the child would be alone and unsuspecting. Witnesses later recounted seeing suspicious activity in the area prior to the abduction, although no one suspected the full extent of what was about to occur. The calculated nature of the crime indicated a level of foresight and cold intent that went far beyond impulsive teenage misbehavior. Forensic evidence collected at the scene played a crucial role in reconstructing the sequence of events. Items belonging to Lori were found in locations associated with Melinda and her associates, and traces of DNA and fingerprints linked her directly to the crime. Investigators noted that the crime scene displayed hallmarks of premeditation, from the methods used to restrain the victim to the careful disposal of evidence. Each finding painted a picture of a young perpetrator who had moved well beyond mere adolescent mischief, demonstrating both a capacity for planning and an unsettling disregard for human life. Law enforcement officials described the case as challenging due to Melinda's ability to manipulate perceptions. Interviews with neighbors and family members revealed that she maintained a facade of normalcy even in the days leading up to the abduction. Her interactions with authorities and acquaintances were often marked by charm and calculated compliance, making it difficult for those around her to recognize the threat she posed. This duality, the appearance of innocence masking calculated cruelty, was a recurring theme in her criminal history, and it became painfully evident in the handling of this case. The timeline of the abduction and murder revealed a methodical approach. Lori was taken from a familiar environment, and her movements were carefully controlled to minimize the risk of detection. Investigators reconstructed her final hours through witness accounts, forensic analysis, and digital evidence, each piece corroborating the deliberate nature of the crime. The murder itself, though brief in duration, reflected a level of violence that shocked the community, leaving parents and children reeling from the realization that someone so young could orchestrate such harm. Community response was immediate and intense. News of Lori Dan's abduction spread quickly, triggering widespread fear and a surge in protective measures among families. Parents were warned to monitor children closely, schools increased security, and local law enforcement devoted significant resources to tracking the perpetrators. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate victim, as the town struggled to reconcile the notion that someone from within their own community, someone still in her teens, could commit such a calculated act of violence. Witness testimonies later revealed that Melinda had exhibited troubling behaviors in the period leading up to the crime, including stalking tendencies and increasingly aggressive interactions with peers. While some signs had been observed by neighbors and educators, the severity and potential consequences were not fully understood until the crime occurred. This gap between early warning signs and decisive intervention underscored the systemic failures that allowed her escalation to reach this point. During the investigation, authorities pieced together the collaboration between Melinda and her accomplices. Their roles were delineated with surprising clarity. Some facilitated access, others provided distraction or diversion, but Melinda's involvement was central. Her leadership in orchestrating the abduction demonstrated a level of assertiveness and control consistent with patterns observed in previous offenses. The combination of strategic planning, manipulative skill, and willingness to engage in extreme violence marked a turning point in her criminal profile. The trial and subsequent legal proceedings focused heavily on establishing the extent of Melinda's premeditation and responsibility. Prosecutors emphasized forensic evidence, eyewitness accounts, and patterns of behavior to argue that she was fully aware of the consequences of her actions. Defense arguments attempted to frame her actions as impulsive or influenced by troubled adolescence, but the weight of evidence painted a different picture: a young individual whose criminal tendencies had matured into a deliberate and destructive force. The impact on the community was long-lasting. Families of victims struggled with grief and trauma, while neighbors and local institutions were forced to confront the reality of violent crime within their own environment. Media coverage amplified the story, highlighting both the horror of the act and the complexity of Melinda's character. The abduction and murder of Lori Dan became a defining moment in her trajectory, bridging the gap between adolescent rebellion and full-scale criminality, and marking her as a figure whose actions would remain infamous for years to come. This chapter of Melinda's life illustrates the culmination of patterns established in her early years. The neglect, family conflict, and early aggression that characterized her childhood and adolescence converged into an act of extreme violence, demonstrating how unaddressed trauma and behavioral escalation can lead to devastating outcomes. Understanding this crime in detail is essential, as it highlights the transition from juvenile misbehavior to calculated adult criminality, providing context for the events that followed in her life. The abduction and murder of Lori Dan serve as a stark reminder of the potential consequences when early warning signs are overlooked and interventions fail. Melinda Loveless, once a troubled adolescent, had now crossed a line that transformed her into a criminal whose actions would leave a permanent mark on her community. The meticulous planning, psychological manipulation, and ruthless execution of this crime foreshadowed the further extremes of behavior that would define her future, solidifying her place in the annals of true crime history. The true danger of Melinda Loveless extended far beyond physical aggression; it lay in her uncanny ability to manipulate those around her. By the time her criminal activities had escalated to serious offenses, she had developed a level of cunning that allowed her to deceive not only peers and family but also law enforcement. This skill became a defining characteristic, one that distinguished her from impulsive offenders and marked her as a calculated, premeditated threat. Understanding Melinda's methods of manipulation is essential to comprehending the full scope of her criminality. From a young age, Melinda demonstrated a talent for charm when it suited her purposes. Neighbors and relatives frequently remarked on her seemingly ordinary demeanor, noting moments when she appeared cooperative, friendly, or even vulnerable. These displays, however, were often strategic, designed to lower suspicion and mask her true intentions. Whether interacting with authority figures, peers, or victims, she was able to project a controlled image that concealed the depth of her aggression. This duality allowed her to navigate social situations with remarkable effectiveness, deflecting scrutiny while advancing her own objectives. Her relationships with accomplices were similarly calculated. Melinda was adept at identifying individuals whose skills, resources, or vulnerabilities could be exploited to facilitate her criminal goals. She often assumed a leadership role, directing the actions of others while presenting herself as a collaborator or co-equal. Witnesses and law enforcement accounts describe her as persuasive and dominant, able to instill a sense of loyalty or fear in those who assisted her. This dynamic was not merely opportunistic. It reflected a deliberate understanding of human psychology and an ability to manipulate social hierarchies to her advantage. Victims, too, fell prey to Melinda's deceptive strategies. She had an intuitive sense of how to identify weaknesses and exploit them. In many cases, her victims initially perceived her as harmless or trustworthy, only to discover the full extent of her intentions when it was too late. This capacity for psychological manipulation was evident in both the planning and execution of her crimes. By creating a false sense of security, she reduced resistance and increased her ability to control outcomes, a pattern that would recur throughout her criminal career. Authorities noted that Melinda's manipulation extended into interactions with law enforcement. During initial investigations, she often presented a cooperative and remorseful front, providing statements or explanations that appeared plausible. However, forensic evidence and witness accounts frequently contradicted her narratives, revealing intentional deception. This ability to mislead officials delayed interventions, complicated investigations, and allowed her to continue her criminal activities longer than might have been possible for a less calculating offender. Her behavior demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of how to exploit institutional processes and human expectations for personal gain. Family members were not immune to her manipulations. Melinda's interactions with her parents, siblings, and extended relatives often involved selective disclosure, exaggeration, or outright fabrication. By controlling the flow of information, she was able to maintain a veneer of normalcy while concealing the extent of her aggression and transgressions. These tactics created confusion and tension within her household, further isolating her from potential sources of guidance or intervention. The ability to manipulate even those closest to her highlights the depth of her psychological sophistication and the deliberate nature of her conduct. Psychological analyses of her behavior suggest that Melinda possessed traits consistent with psychopathy and antisocial personality patterns. Her charm, superficial empathy, and manipulative tactics were not signs of innocence but tools for achieving control. Experts emphasize that individuals with these characteristics are often able to plan complex actions, anticipate responses, and exploit emotional vulnerabilities in others. In Melinda's case, these traits amplified the effectiveness of her criminal strategies, making her a far more dangerous offender than her age or appearance might have suggested. Her premeditation was evident in the careful orchestration of events surrounding her crimes. From selecting targets and planning logistics to coordinating accomplices and managing potential witnesses, every aspect reflected a strategic approach. Unlike impulsive offenders, Melinda's actions were often calculated to maximize control and minimize exposure. Law enforcement reports noted the precision with which she executed plans, highlighting her ability to anticipate obstacles and adapt quickly when confronted with unexpected challenges. This foresight and adaptability distinguished her from other adolescent offenders, reinforcing the perception of her as a deliberate and dangerous actor. Even in the aftermath of her crimes, manipulation continued to play a role. Melinda was able to influence perceptions, control narratives, and mitigate consequences by presenting selective truths or outright falsehoods. Her interactions during interrogations and court proceedings demonstrated an ongoing capacity to project confidence, deflect blame, and maintain composure under scrutiny. This ongoing deception ensured that her criminal identity remained partially obscured, even as evidence mounted against her. The combination of psychological cunning, strategic planning, and social manipulation made Melinda Loveless uniquely dangerous. Her crimes were not random outbursts of violence but the result of a carefully constructed pattern of deception, control, and intimidation. By understanding the methods she employed to manipulate others, investigators, psychologists, and the public could better comprehend the full scope of her criminality. The acts themselves were violent, but the mechanisms that facilitated them, trust exploited, authority deflected, and perception controlled, revealed a deeper, more calculated threat. This chapter highlights the essential link between early behavioral patterns and later criminal sophistication. The charm, deception, and manipulation that Melinda displayed were extensions of skills she had honed throughout childhood and adolescence, now applied with precision in the context of serious crime. Recognizing these traits is critical not only for understanding her individual case but also for broader insights into the psychology of offenders who escalate from juvenile misconduct to calculated adult criminality. In the end, Melinda Loveless's capacity for manipulation and deception underscores a fundamental truth about her criminal trajectory: her acts of violence were never impulsive accidents. They were facilitated by a mind that understood human behavior, exploited vulnerabilities, and executed plans with deliberate intent. Her cunning ensured that the consequences of her crimes would ripple outward, affecting victims, families, and communities long after each act was committed. The trajectory of Melinda Loveless's criminal career reached a turning point with her apprehension, an event that marked the beginning of public scrutiny and the legal reckoning for her actions. Her capture was the result of a combination of meticulous investigative work, witness testimony, and forensic evidence, each piece of the puzzle gradually narrowing the focus onto her as the central perpetrator. Law enforcement agencies involved in the case emphasized the challenges they faced. Melinda's history of manipulation and calculated behavior made her difficult to track, yet the accumulation of evidence eventually led to her arrest. The investigation was extensive and multifaceted. Detectives revisited old reports of her prior offenses, examined patterns in her behavior, and compiled statements from neighbors, peers, and relatives. Forensic analysis of evidence from the abduction and murder of Lori Dan provided critical links, including fingerprints, DNA traces, and items associated with the crime. Investigators worked tirelessly to corroborate witness accounts, reconstruct timelines, and identify the roles of accomplices. Each breakthrough narrowed the scope of suspicion, ultimately centering on Melinda as the orchestrator of a series of escalating crimes. Melinda's arrest itself was carefully coordinated. Officers approached with caution, aware of her history of defiance and aggression. When confronted, she maintained a composed and seemingly cooperative demeanor, consistent with patterns of manipulation observed throughout her life. Initial questioning revealed both evasive responses and selective admissions, a strategy that would characterize her interactions with authorities throughout the investigation. Despite these attempts at deception, the mounting evidence left little room for doubt regarding her culpability. Public reaction to Melinda's apprehension was immediate and intense. Media coverage highlighted the shocking nature of her crimes, focusing not only on the violence she had perpetrated but also on her age, appearance, and apparent normalcy. Communities that had once dismissed her early behaviors as mischief now confronted the full extent of her actions. Parents, educators, and neighbors grappled with a sense of betrayal, recognizing that someone they had observed and interacted with could execute such calculated acts of harm. This public scrutiny added pressure to law enforcement and prosecutors to ensure a thorough and transparent legal process. The trial itself revealed the complexity of prosecuting a young offender with a history of calculated deception. The prosecution's case relied heavily on forensic evidence, witness testimony, and documented behavioral patterns. Experts were called to provide psychological profiles, detailing Melinda's manipulative tendencies, premeditated behavior, and potential for future risk. These analyses reinforced the argument that her actions were deliberate and planned, rather than impulsive outbursts of adolescent anger. The prosecution sought to demonstrate that each criminal act was part of a continuum, linking early misbehavior to the ultimate abduction and murder. Defense strategies, conversely, focused on mitigating culpability by emphasizing her age, troubled upbringing, and prior trauma. Attorneys argued that her behaviors reflected adolescent impulsivity and emotional instability rather than a fully formed intent to commit violent crimes. They highlighted instances of cooperation, moments of apparent remorse, and inconsistencies in witness accounts to challenge the prosecution's narrative. Despite these efforts, the weight of forensic evidence, detailed timelines, and corroborating testimonies created a compelling case for accountability. Courtroom dynamics were tense and charged with emotion. Victims' families attended proceedings, often visibly shaken by testimony and evidence presented. The judge and jury were confronted with a complex portrait of a young offender whose intelligence, charm, and manipulative skills masked a capacity for extreme violence. Witnesses recounted the fear and confusion they experienced at the hands of Melinda and her accomplices, emphasizing the deliberate and calculated nature of her actions. The trial became a study in contrasts, a young woman appearing composed and ordinary juxtaposed against the severity of her crimes and the suffering inflicted upon others. Psychological profiling played a significant role in shaping the understanding of Melinda's criminality. Experts detailed her capacity for strategic thinking, ability to manipulate social situations, and lack of empathy, reinforcing the prosecution's argument that her offenses were premeditated. These analyses provided the court with insight into her motivations, revealing a consistent pattern of control and deception that aligned with behaviors observed since childhood. The combination of behavioral history, forensic evidence, and expert testimony painted a comprehensive picture of her criminal profile, leaving little room for doubt regarding her responsibility. Ultimately, the trial outcome reflected the convergence of evidence, psychological analysis, and legal argumentation. The court recognized the seriousness of Melinda's actions and the sophistication with which she executed them. Sentencing took into account both her age and the severity of the offenses, balancing considerations of potential rehabilitation against the need for accountability. The legal proceedings not only determined her fate but also served as a public reckoning for the community, validating the experiences of victims and reinforcing the consequences of unchecked criminal behavior. The capture and trial of Melinda Loveless illustrate the intersection of investigative diligence, forensic science, and psychological insight in prosecuting complex criminal cases. Each step, from arrest to courtroom testimony, highlighted both her cunning and the systemic challenges in addressing offenses committed by a young but calculated offender. The process revealed the importance of thorough evidence collection, careful witness documentation, and expert analysis in constructing a case capable of withstanding manipulation and deception. This chapter bridges the transition from Melinda's adolescence into full acknowledgement of her status as a serious criminal. The capture and subsequent trial not only held her accountable for her actions but also provided insight into the mechanisms by which she had executed her crimes. It demonstrated that the escalation observed in her early years, the manipulation detailed in her interactions, and the premeditation evident in her offenses culminated in legal scrutiny capable of unraveling the sophisticated pattern of her criminal behavior. Through the legal proceedings, the community, investigators, and observers were forced to confront the reality of Melinda Loveless, a young individual whose intelligence, cunning, and capacity for manipulation were inextricably linked to acts of extreme violence. The trial served as both a reckoning and a warning, highlighting how early interventions, behavioral patterns, and strategic deception intersected to produce a criminal trajectory that shocked everyone who witnessed it. After the trial and sentencing, Melinda Loveless was transferred to a correctional facility where she would begin the complex process of adapting to life behind bars. Prison presented a radically different environment from her previous experiences, a space defined by strict routines, hierarchical social structures, and constant surveillance. For Melinda, this transition tested not only her ability to navigate authority but also her capacity to interact with other inmates while maintaining control over her image and influence. Early days in prison revealed the persistence of behaviors that had characterized her criminal history. Melinda quickly assessed the social dynamics among inmates, identifying both threats and opportunities. Observers noted her ability to form alliances selectively, cultivating relationships that provided protection or strategic advantage. While she displayed moments of compliance with rules, these were often calculated, designed to maintain favor with staff or avoid unnecessary conflict. Her approach reflected a continuation of the manipulation and social intelligence that had facilitated her criminal activities outside prison walls. Interactions with other inmates were complex and multifaceted. Some recognized her notoriety and treated her with caution or deference, while others tested boundaries to gauge her reaction. Melinda navigated these interactions with careful calculation, asserting dominance when necessary but avoiding unnecessary confrontation that could jeopardize her standing. Reports from correctional officers highlighted her adaptability, noting that she was neither overtly aggressive nor entirely passive, but instead maintained a balance that maximized her control in the environment. Rehabilitation programs offered within the facility became both a challenge and an opportunity for Melinda. Psychological evaluations and counseling sessions aimed to address past trauma, behavioral patterns, and potential for future rehabilitation. These assessments revealed a complex psychological profile, intelligence coupled with manipulative tendencies, emotional detachment alongside occasional displays of remorse, and a strategic approach to social interactions. While some progress was noted in controlled environments, psychologists emphasized that her underlying patterns of manipulation and control were deeply ingrained, suggesting that rehabilitation would require sustained and intensive intervention. Notable incidents during her incarceration further illustrated her adaptability and cunning. On multiple occasions, Melinda managed to influence the behavior of other inmates, often through subtle intimidation, strategic alliances, or the exploitation of vulnerabilities. These events reinforced the understanding that her capacity for manipulation extended beyond the outside world and into the prison environment, where social hierarchies and behavioral cues were constantly in flux. Staff observed that she could command attention and influence outcomes without resorting to overt violence, relying instead on psychological insight and calculated interaction. Despite the structured environment of the facility, Melinda also faced internal challenges. The confinement forced her to confront the consequences of her actions, offering periods of reflection and self-assessment. Some reports indicate moments where she expressed remorse or acknowledgement of the harm she had caused, though these were often tempered by defensiveness or attempts to rationalize past behaviors. These instances provided insight into her capacity for self-awareness, even as patterns of manipulation and strategic behavior remained prominent. Educational and vocational programs became avenues for structured engagement. Melinda participated in some offerings, demonstrating intelligence and the ability to learn new skills. These activities offered her a controlled sense of achievement and reinforced routines that were essential for managing life within prison. Yet, even in these programs, staff noted her tendency to assess situations carefully, evaluate the motivations of peers, and leverage opportunities to her advantage. Her engagement reflected both genuine interest in self-improvement and a continuation of calculated interaction within a constrained environment. The psychological evaluations conducted over time emphasized the complexity of Melinda's character. Experts noted the interplay between trauma, personality traits, and learned behaviors, highlighting the long-term impact of her childhood experiences on her criminal and social behaviors. These analyses suggested that while her environment in prison could offer opportunities for rehabilitation, her ingrained patterns of manipulation and control would continue to pose challenges for both staff and peers. Understanding her psychological makeup became crucial for anticipating behaviors, managing interactions, and designing effective interventions. By observing Melinda in prison, it became clear that life behind bars did not erase the traits that had defined her earlier life, rather, it provided a different context in which these traits manifested. Her intelligence, social awareness, and strategic thinking allowed her to adapt and navigate complex social hierarchies, while her manipulative tendencies and emotional detachment remained evident. The prison environment became both a mirror and a testing ground, revealing aspects of her character that had contributed to her criminal trajectory and continued to shape her interactions with the world. Ultimately, Melinda Loveless's life behind bars offers a window into the multidimensional nature of her personality. Beyond the crimes that brought her notoriety, her adaptation to confinement, interactions with others, and engagement with rehabilitation efforts reveal a mind capable of strategic thought, social navigation, and reflection, even within the limitations of incarceration. These insights not only deepen understanding of her character but also underscore the ongoing challenges of managing individuals whose criminal behavior is intertwined with complex psychological and social patterns. Life behind bars, therefore, represents both consequence and continuation. The confinement imposed limits on her ability to act violently in the outside world, yet it also showcased the enduring patterns of intelligence, manipulation, and calculated behavior that had defined her criminal life. Melinda's prison experience illustrates that understanding a criminal is not limited to their actions outside confinement, it requires observation of how they navigate and adapt to structured, controlled environments, revealing enduring traits that shape both behavior and potential for rehabilitation. The story of Melinda Loveless left an indelible mark on the communities she terrorized, the families she affected, and the institutions tasked with monitoring and preventing juvenile delinquency. Her crimes, beginning as early childhood aggression and escalating into calculated violence, became a case study in the consequences of unaddressed trauma and systemic failures. The legacy she left is one of fear, reflection, and difficult lessons that continue to resonate in discussions of criminal psychology and juvenile justice. For victims' families, the impact was profound and enduring. The abduction, threats, and manipulation inflicted emotional trauma that extended far beyond the immediate events. Parents and siblings struggled with grief, anger, and a pervasive sense of vulnerability, often questioning how someone so young could commit such calculated acts. Support networks and counseling efforts became essential in helping families navigate the aftermath, yet the psychological scars persisted, a constant reminder of the danger Melinda represented. The ripple effects extended into the broader community, where trust was eroded and vigilance became a daily necessity. Law enforcement agencies reflected on the case as both a success and a cautionary tale. The meticulous investigation, collection of forensic evidence, and eventual apprehension of Melinda demonstrated effective police work, yet officials acknowledged the missed opportunities that could have prevented escalation. Prior reports of early misbehavior, peer intimidation, and minor offenses were not fully addressed, highlighting weaknesses in monitoring and intervention strategies. The case underscored the need for improved communication between schools, social services, and law enforcement, particularly when young individuals display patterns of escalating aggression and manipulation. Media coverage of Melinda Loveless played a dual role in shaping public perception and reinforcing fear. Headlines often emphasized the shocking nature of her crimes, the incongruity of her age with the severity of her actions, and the calculated methods she employed. While this coverage brought attention to the risks of juvenile criminal escalation, it also sparked ethical debates about sensationalism and the portrayal of young offenders. Discussions emerged around how media framing could influence both community response and judicial proceedings, highlighting the balance between public awareness and responsible reporting. Psychological reflection on Melinda's life has become a cornerstone of understanding the trajectory from childhood trauma to extreme criminal behavior. Experts analyzing her history consistently point to the combination of early neglect, exposure to violence, and unstable family dynamics as key factors shaping her aggression and manipulation. Her adolescence, marked by defiance, peer influence, and early criminal acts, demonstrated how unaddressed psychological needs can evolve into deliberate and destructive behavior. By tracing these patterns, psychologists and criminal justice professionals aim to identify warning signs and develop intervention strategies for at-risk youth. Ethical debates surrounding Melinda's case extend beyond media coverage. Questions about culpability, the effectiveness of juvenile rehabilitation, and the societal responsibility to prevent escalation are central to discussions about her crimes. Her youth at the time of early offenses complicates assessments of intent, yet the calculated nature of later acts reinforces the challenge of balancing accountability with the potential for rehabilitation. Scholars and practitioners continue to examine how legal systems, mental health services, and educational institutions can collaborate to mitigate risks while respecting the developmental realities of adolescent offenders. The broader societal impact of Melinda Loveless's actions includes heightened awareness of the potential for violence among young individuals and the need for vigilant, coordinated responses. Her case has informed policies and practices in juvenile justice, forensic psychology, and community safety, emphasizing early identification, comprehensive evaluation, and intervention strategies tailored to individual risk profiles. By studying her trajectory, professionals aim to prevent similar outcomes and to understand the interplay between environment, personality, and opportunity in the development of criminal behavior. Reflecting on her life also offers insight into the complexities of human behavior. Melinda Loveless was a product of her environment, shaped by trauma and neglect, yet she also made conscious decisions that led to harm and suffering. Her capacity for manipulation, planning, and control illustrates the intricate ways in which intelligence and personality traits can be applied destructively. This duality, between potential for normal development and the deliberate choice to harm, underscores the difficulty of predicting and preventing criminal trajectories, even when warning signs are apparent. Ultimately, the legacy of Melinda Loveless is one of both fear and reflection. Her crimes serve as a stark reminder of the consequences of unaddressed trauma, systemic failures, and early behavioral warning signs. They prompt ongoing consideration of how society, families, and institutions can intervene effectively while navigating the ethical and practical complexities of juvenile justice. From a troubled childhood to acts that shocked communities, her life trajectory illuminates the delicate balance between environment, choice, and consequence in shaping human behavior. The story of Melinda Loveless concludes not with resolution but with lessons about the importance of vigilance, the potential for escalation when warning signs are ignored, and the enduring impact of violence on victims and communities. Her life, both in crime and in reflection, remains a subject of study, debate, and caution, offering insight into the dark intersections of childhood trauma, psychological manipulation, and extreme criminal behavior.